That's incredible, sir. I always thought that Doc Holliday was the one that killed him.
Sorry I had to ruin the legend for you, boy. But the legend ain't always true.
Hi guys, my name's Dav and welcome to D&DGaming. In for review this time around, it is Wild West first-person shooter Call of Juarez Gunslinger. Reviewing the game with me is my brother Dale.
Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Call of Juarez Gunslinger is a first-person shooter set in the Wild West, developed by Techland and originally published by Ubisoft, but now published by Techland Publishing. It was released for Microsoft Windows, PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 in May 2013. In December 2019, it was ported to the Nintendo Switch. It's the fourth game in the Call of Juarez series, although narratively it is unrelated to the three previous titles. The game tells the story of Silas Greaves, a bounty hunter in the American West during the second half of the 19th century. Telling his story to a group of saloon patrons in 1910, Silas's increasingly grandiose and difficult to believe tales find him hunting Roscoe, Rustling Bob Bryant, as he either teams up with or squares off against Wild West legends such as Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid and Jesse James, amongst many others. So Dav, what were your first impressions of this one?
So my initial impression from looking at the screenshots of the game was Wild West, gunslinging, FPS. Actually reminded me of a game called Gun, which I had on PS1 back in the early 2000s, although that was a third-person Wild West game, to be fair. I think it may have just been the kind of Wild West setting that got me thinking of that, I suppose.
Yeah, in terms of my first impressions, it's a very arcadey style game that really focuses on fast-paced gunplay and quick reaction times, and usually with large swarms of enemies coming at you. Wild West setting isn't too common in gaming, so it's quite fun to play a game in this setting. I like the fact it quickly introduces a range of kind of historically accurate characters and places that you often only hear about in old stories of the Wild West. So yeah, it was really kind of unique in its Wild West setting. I mean, obviously you've got the games like Red Dead Redemption and that, but there's not that many relatively. So yeah, it was good fun to play this one. So what were your general thoughts following your playthrough?
I really enjoyed the game. It had a few frustrations in places, but on the whole, we'll go into further detail in the review, but I thought it was a gripping story, told in an interesting way, good gunplay, convincing environments. Yeah, it's a really enjoyable game. Reminded me of a kind of mixture of Gun, the game mentioned earlier, and something like Borderlands, really.
Yeah, this is a very linear style game, and there's not much in the way of exploration. You can't stray too far outside the boundaries of the level, otherwise it kind of kicks you back in. But once I realised it was one of these linear games, you know, arcade kind of on rails type shooter, I was happy just to, you know, enjoy the gunplay really and the story. It was a nice variety of weapons that all seemed at least, you know, fairly historically accurate. It does stay true to the time and setting with no kind of ridiculous weapons or abilities or anything like that. I found the unique graphics really worked with a Wild West setting. As you kind of touched on, it certainly reminded me a bit of Borderlands as well. It had an almost cartoony style to it, and when it was telling parts of the story, it's almost like a old Wild West like comic book style storytelling, which was cool. It's a relatively short game. I completed the main story and all the arcade missions in just over 7 hours, so it's not long by any stretch of the imagination. But then at times it really did feel like you could be, you know, in an arcade playing this. It's very much one of those sort of games, and yeah, I like the fact it was easy to jump into for kind of quick sections of the story without getting stuck in it for hours. How about graphic options?
Yeah, so there's very few graphic options to choose from really, which I thought was a bit of a shame. Just simple texture, shadow, foliage quality and view distance really, and that was about it.
Yeah, I found relatively limited options, as you say, kind of sufficient enough, I guess, but it would have been nice to, I know I always say this, but have a FOV slider. I mean, come on, first person shooters, it really should be in all of them, because they really can make or break it for some people. And in this case, it was set quite well at default, but is it that hard to add them in?
So in terms of graphics and graphic performance, we'll put our PC specs up on screen as always, but I ran the game on highest graphic settings, very few of them, but the highest. And it ran perfectly well on my PC, actually no frame drops or graphical issues of any kind. The graphics themselves, I really like them actually. Like I said earlier, they remind me of Borderlands. For anyone that hasn't played Borderlands before, the graphics in that and the same in this are kind of a cartoonish hand-drawn art style, which sounds kind of odd for an FPS game, but the graphic style works really well in Borderlands, and it actually worked really well in this too, in the sort of Wild West setting. It sounds strange to say it, but I thought the graphics linked in well with the storytelling. The story is narrated as you go through. We'll talk about it in more detail shortly, but the hand-drawn style really worked well with it. It was kind of like the art style had come out of a book or a comic, as Dale mentioned earlier, and that the story is being narrated as you go along, and that sort of arty kind of hand-drawn style kind of worked really well with the story, I think.
Ran well for me with no noticeable frame drops or other issues. I also really like the graphic style, just really cool in this one, quite unique, while similar to some other games such as Borderlands, like Dav's already said. It still kind of stood out on its own in a way, in a positive way, I think. It was developed in the Chrome Engine 5, which is a proprietary game engine developed by Techland. For me, it stood up there like it could have been like an Unreal Engine type game, and yeah, it just looked really, really good. So in terms of player control options,
being a typical FPS, the game is first-person view only. Full key rebindings are available in the control settings menu, and controller support is also available, although we didn't actually test that as part of the review. I played the game on keyboard and mouse, and the controls were mainly the usual FPS style, so was sad for movement, shift to run, control to duck, left mouse to shoot, etc. But you can rebind the keys, as mentioned. The duals require a mixture of keyboard and mouse control. It's quite difficult. I found it a little bit clunky. I think it could have been done a bit better. I felt that they kind of overcomplicated it a bit.
I also played on keyboard and mouse, has all the usual standard controls for the most part, so although the full rebindings are available, I didn't feel the need to change anything. There's quite a few of those kind of quick time events in this, which was interesting because, again, you don't get that in too many games, certainly not these days. Obviously, this is from 2013, and I think at the time there was a few more, that were still doing that. But along with the kind of duels, which had their own style, and then you had the usual controls for the free shooting.
So in terms of game story, gameplay and mechanics, there's three main game modes: story, arcade and duel. Story mode, you play as bounty hunter Silas Greaves as he tells his story to people in the saloon bar, and you play through the story as he narrates over the top. The stories include hunting down the biggest and most notorious figures in the American Wild West. You chase figures such as Billy the Kid, the Dalton Gang, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and of course, arguably the most notorious of them all, Jesse James. You blast your way through varying environments, from typical Wild West towns and villages to mountain passes, steam trains to swamps. The one I particularly liked was a shootout at a sawmill, and the levels are typically set out as episodes. As Silas narrates over your gameplay, you also hear from the people he's telling the story to in the bar. They at times become suspicious of his telling of the events, and this sometimes causes quick changes of direction to the story, sometimes changes to the environment, and at times an actual reversal and replay of certain sections as the story changes. It sounds clunky when explaining it, but it's actually done really well in the game.
You also have the arcade mode, which in this you play through basically the episodes from the story, but with a high score system in place for kills and with an online leaderboard. There are 10 arcade levels in total, which are linked to the story mode, as I mentioned, but usually just a little shorter than the level you play through in the story mode. And it tends to focus on the kind of quicker playthrough, getting as high a score, linking as many kind of kills through as you can, and then it gives you a total score at the end.
The duels mode are basically the duels from the story, but set consecutively with a set number of lives.
In terms of game mechanics, it's an arcade-style shooting game, as we already mentioned. You get points for different types of kills, headshots, using the environment to kill, multi-kills, etc. The weapons vary from 6-shooters, Smith & Wesson-style handguns, to shotguns, rifles, throwing sticks of dynamite, and in a few places, a stationary Gatling gun. The weapons themselves, other than the Gatling gun, can be upgraded to various levels to include faster reload times, holding more ammo, varying and more powerful designs, and much more. You can also unlock unique weapons which are upgraded visually and with additional minor abilities. There are varying ambush opportunities where you can blow enemies up with barrels of gunpowder, drop things on them such as logs, and generally just use your environment to your advantage. There are elements of QTE, as already mentioned at times, but not many through the game as a whole. As already mentioned, QTE stands for Quick Time Event, which is basically where a button flashes up and you have to press it before it disappears to perform the action. If you miss it, another alternative action happens. Enemies are usually gangs of bandits, but you occasionally come up against Native Americans, and of course there's notorious figures themselves, some of which are quite difficult to take out. You can collect nuggets of truth that tell you about particular figures, gangs, and about the Wild West in general. These are usually an item such as a cowboy hat or a scroll of paper or similar Wild West type item that are quite obvious once you know what to look for. Once collected, you can open them up in the menu to view as cards of information.
The UI is relatively simple. You have a gun icon in the top left that fills up as you get points for kills, and then you use Q on the keyboard to enter concentration mode. The screen goes black and white, and the enemies are shown as red and slowed down, enabling you to aim easier. In the top right, you have a sense of death indicator. When this is full, this enables you to avoid lethal shots from enemies. These are where the game slows down and zooms in on the enemy while they shoot a single bullet at you. You can then lean left or right using A or D on the keyboard to avoid the bullet. If your indicator is not full, however, you can't lean and you get a bullet in the head. The ammo you have for a weapon comes up as you reload, but then disappears again, giving a clean look to the UI for the most part. So in terms of sound and music, there's quite a variety of music in the game. I have to say, I thought it was awesome. It all suited the game perfectly and really gave it the Wild West vibes. I thought the voice acting was really good. All the NPCs sounded really convincing.
At the same time?
Yeah, they were sisters. Polygyny is traditional among the Mescalero.
So what happened?
Oh, I had to get out of there. Those girls never shut up. Both of them nagging at me all the time. Drove me half crazy. Haven't seen them since.
No, I mean, what happened with Grey Wolf?
Oh, well, I pursued him into the Cave of Death.
The sounds from the enemies were funny, and they had quite a repertoire of things they would say as well.
What the hell?
The general game environment sounds were really good. The creaking sounds that come from the wooden buildings, the animal sounds, etc. in the environment are all really good.
Yeah, I thought the voice acting was great in this one. Really impressed with it, and they all had that very convincing kind of Wild West accent without sounding too cheesy. The gun sounds were great as well, actually, and the general environmental sounds, you know, the explosions, yeah, everything really added to the immersion. I thought the general background music was great as well, really suited the setting, and as Dav said, it kind of gives that Wild West vibe to it.
So in terms of bugs and glitches, I didn't come across any major bugs or glitches. A few funny dead enemies where one was in the ground with his feet just sticking out. And one where Curly Bill was stuck.
Curly Bill.
And one where Curly Bill
5 hours later.
And one where Curly Bill got stuck, so it was really easy to kill.
Yeah, luckily I didn't come across any bugs or significant glitches at all, really, and Curly Bill was perfectly fine for me. Curly Bill.
5 hours later.
So to sum up, things I liked about the game. The story was awesome and really inventively told. The fact that you were chasing down these notorious bandits and groups from Wild West history was really cool. I like the nuggets of truth. They were really cool to learn more about the criminals and bandits that you're chasing down. I thought the graphic style worked really well for the Western subgenre of FPS games. Although quite arcade-like in style, the gunplay was really good and it really felt like you were a bounty hunter taking out these notorious figures.
Yeah, in terms of things I liked about it, I feel like this is one of those games with quite high replayability. For example, to try for new high scores in the arcade mode, or to go through the story again in different sections just to find all the secrets. I did enjoy the dialogue, and there were some really funny sections. The narrator himself was really well written, and yeah, great voice acting. It was a unique story, the way it was told. As you play it sometimes corrects itself, as Dav mentioned earlier. You can almost like go back on a section because he corrects himself in the story, and yeah, really unique way of doing it. Gunplay was just fun at times, taking out hundreds of enemies sometimes. Might be on a Gatling gun and throwing sticks of dynamite at them. Yeah, it was just a really good fun gunplay to this one. Wild West setting was great. It was good to have all the famous characters. As Duff has already mentioned, Jesse James and Butch Cassidy, and all integrated into the story and done in a really good way.
Don't forget Curly Bill.
Curly Bill.
So things I didn't like about the game. The enemies can be quite spongy at times, which I found a bit frustrating in a few places. The difficulty swings quite substantially. I found some bits where I was just flying through, just blasting the enemies with no problem. It was, if anything, too easy. And then the next minute you come across a really hard bit that would take a huge number of tries. There didn't seem to be a kind of mid-ground there, really. The controls are a bit too basic. There was no lean function in the main game controls, only in the lethal shot parts when you're using the death sense function, which I found annoying as I'm so used to having a lean function in most FPS games I've played. So I kept pressing Q expecting him to lean, and as most games are Q and E with leaning on the keyboard, and it would go into a concentration mode each time. So it took me a while to get used to that. It was hard to know when you were close to death as there was no health bar of any kind. The upgrade for finding the nuggets of truth easier was kind of pointless. I thought it would alert you from quite a distance away when I decided to upgrade it, but it turned out that you still had to be right next to the nugget for the sound icon and notification to actually pop up and alert you. This was a pointless upgrade, in my opinion.
In terms of things I didn't like, I found the duel feature was fun the first couple of times, but quickly got old and could actually be quite frustrating at times. The game was a little on the short side, even though it's split up into quite a few episodes. Each one is actually really quite short. Again, this can sometimes be an advantage if you just want to jump in. You're not going to get stuck in it for hours, but yeah, again, it felt a bit too arcadey at times in that sense. It did also get rather repetitive at times, mostly just shooting waves of enemies popping up, literally like it's an arcade game. And yeah, they weren't particularly intelligent AI at times. They pretty much just sit behind cover, pop out, take a few shots at you, pop back. They wouldn't necessarily try and flank you. There was a couple of levels where you could get surrounded, but more often than not, they were literally just right ahead of you with no ability to kind of get around you and make it more challenging. Do you think the hitboxes could be better? And there was a couple of times I noticed where it would actually catch kind of the side of a wall, or I could see the enemy behind cover, and my aim was dead on and should be able to just catch the side of him, or just the side of his head or something like that. But it wouldn't register it. It would just it's like the hitbox on the section of wall or the section of cover was too large, so it wasn't quite catching the enemy. And sometimes the hits didn't seem to kind of register at all, and so it did at times feel like Dav mentioned that the enemies could be a bit spongy, and again very random as to when that would happen. I'd kind of take a shot and think, oh, that was dead on, and then realise that it didn't seem to register. So, in terms of missed opportunities, what do you think what this one does?
I thought the environments were quite linear, and I think they could have opened these up in more places, really. They felt quite narrow and as Dale said earlier, a bit on rails.
Yeah, I feel there could have been a wider range of enemy types. There are basically only 4 types of varying enemies, including like a shotgunner guy, a guy with a shield who literally has a hole in the shield that you can shoot him through anyway, and the kind of boss levels, and then your normal kind of characters. But yeah, this generally wasn't much variation in them, and again it was just like shooting ducks at an arcade or something. It was very simple at times, and I feel they could have expanded on the enemies just to mix it up a bit. So in terms of scores, Dav, what would you give this one?
Although it had some frustration in places, I really enjoyed the game. It had an inventive, interesting revenge story grounded in Wild West tales, good graphic style, convincing environments, and a great soundtrack, and that ultimately made it a fun game to play and very gripping actually. So it's 8 out of 10 from me.
Yeah, this was a fun game with an engaging story that I did enjoy for the most part. It was a little short though, and a bit on rails at times, but even so, it's still a solid 8 out of 10 from me.
Well guys, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe and comment. Hit that bell icon to be notified when we upload a new video, and we'll see you in the next one.
And wouldn't you know it, that crafty son of a bitch led me right into a trap.
What kind of trap?
Well, son, there had to be at least 100 Apaches around.
100?
God be my witness.
Oh, come on. Who are you kidding?